Hello everyone, welcome to the Narcissism Decoder, a YouTube channel that's designed to take a comprehensive look at the various facets of narcissism from different psychoanalytic perspectives. I'm your host, Dr. Anthony Mazzella. On today's video, we will continue our discussion on the covert narcissist, also known in psychoanalytic terms as the craving narcissist. This is part 2 of what turned out to be a 2-part series on covert narcissism. If you haven't seen part 1, I would recommend that you check that out now. The main goal was to respond to several questions I received regarding the covert narcissist. The central theme of these questions was basically, how can we foster empathy and understanding when navigating relationships with these individuals? But also, what strategies can we employ when trying to relate to them? So in part 1, I spoke about how we can foster empathy and understanding. I put understanding first, and in order to do that, I had to do a quick review and turn briefly to psychoanalytic theory, and we looked at what happens when things in the formative years of development go accordingly, and then subsequently we looked at what happens when things do not go accordingly. For instance, I spoke about the early narcissistic stage of development, also known as the symbiotic phase of the separation individuation process, and how this is a blissful time unless things get disrupted too quickly or too early on and too abruptly. Various disruptive factors were detailed. All narcissists look for a reunion. In other words, that they try to repair this early damage that was done in the formative years. But the mode of repair, the way they repair the disruption, is different for each type or each cluster of narcissism. The covert narcissist or the craving narcissist does it passively, aggressively, but passive-aggressively by putting you in a position to take care of them. But even this gets more complicated because they cannot always accept the care that's offered to them. I gave a few examples of how there is conflict around this magical reunion, a return to a blissful, early narcissistic state, and how this plays out in the adult craving covert narcissist. There are other types though. There are other covert and craving narcissistic individuals where the blurring of boundaries between oneself and others is experienced blissfully instead of ambivalently, which is what I discussed in the prior video. Here's an example of this blissful reunion from an adult covert craving narcissistic individual. When she would experience separation anxiety, which was not always easy to discern, she would collapse, feel too weak to eat, and complain to her mother that she felt physically and emotionally drained. During these reunions with her mother took on an exceptionally nurturing role. It went beyond the mere preparation of a meal. It involved the act of spoon-feeding her adult daughter. This intimate act of nourishment was an illustration of the mother's intense involvement and desire to care for her child, perhaps driven by her own conflict around issues of separation. The act of spoon-feeding can be interpreted as a powerful symbolic gesture. It represents a fusion of physical and emotional sustenance, with the mother taking on the role of provider and protector. Here's another very brief example of this. A patient said to me, again, the covert narcissist who's craving for sustenance, said to me, I'm like a little bird, like I'm a chirping bird, and my beak is wide open, and I'm always looking to be fed. With these individuals, we have to begin to wonder, why is there a constant appeal for supplies? In part, they believe if they get the supplies, there's no frustration. And if there's no frustration, there's no loss. And if there's no loss, there's no separation. So they coerce others to act as an extension of themselves. But, like, think for me, take care of me. These were some of the examples I gave in the prior video. But you could see how we come back to there's no separation. And this links in closely with the theory that I was discussing earlier, where there are struggles during the individuation, where there are struggles with separation and individuation. I think we're now ready to tackle the last part of the question that I outlined at the beginning of the last video, and I alluded to earlier. What strategies can we employ when relating to these individuals? After a review of the available social media content, I discovered the following suggestions. This is the way that we relate to them. Radical acceptance. In other words, accept them for who they are. Don't have any expectations. Have realistic expectations. Don't engage with them. Don't explain yourself. Don't personalize. In other words, don't get pulled in. This was the most common suggestion. Have good, healthy boundaries. And by the way, this is the kind of stuff that one should aspire to in all relationships, but it's not always the stuff that works. In a podcast that I did recently, I demonstrated how this doesn't always work, that this could be a suggestion. You could tell somebody to have healthy boundaries, but that doesn't mean that one then suddenly has the capacity to have healthy boundaries or really understand all of what that means. Being in therapy with the therapist who actually understands covert narcissism. I absolutely agree with that one, of course. But then I also read things like head for the door. That was suggested, right? Because there's nobody there. And even if you're with somebody in a relationship for many years, it's like nobody's home. They're not going to change. That's not been my experience with working with these individuals. And you can call me overly optimistic or Pollyannish, but I do believe there is something there. And borrowing a term from Winnicott, a renowned psychoanalyst, he talks about what's called the true self, that there is a true self inside of these individuals. It may be walled off, but it's there. Here's a very simple example of what I mean. In my work with these individuals, I would sometimes hear, I feel like a nobody. There's no one inside of me. I am worthless. I'm useless. That's why I can't really be with people in a more genuine way. I just want you to give me the answer. I want everybody to tell me what to do. In terms of relating to this kind of individual in a more effective way, what's worked for me is just to maintain a level of curiosity. Can you tell me more about that? What do you picture? So if someone says, I just want you to give me the answers. So what do you picture? What do you imagine? Why is that so important? And then this is what I've heard. So I don't have to take responsibility. So this is a strategy or a tool, if you like to call it that. You may have to work on tolerating your own difficult feelings. In other words, it's not easy when someone is pressing on you to give them the answer, to take care of them, right? So you have to be able to tolerate this feeling inside of you so that you're then freer to remain curious about this demand that's being placed on you. And by the way, this is where theory comes in handy. You now know one of the motives behind this kind of talk. What is the goal? The goal, going back to the theory, is the blissful reunion, right? But this is not in their conscious mind. Therefore, they cannot just switch this off. And you can't tell them to stop complaining or to grow up or to take on more responsibility. Well, I mean, you could tell them that, but most likely what that would do is it would leave them feeling more ashamed or defective or weak. But they wouldn't know that, and you wouldn't know that either. All you would see then would be an increase, an escalation, in other words, of the situation. Perhaps an escalation of the demands that are being placed on you. So let's go back to this scenario. The person says, so I don't have to take responsibility. Talk to them about this thought. What do you picture? What would it be like for you to take on responsibility? I can do something wrong, they may say. Okay, so what happens? Tell me about that. What are you thinking? What if you do something wrong? What will happen? They will leave me. Inevitably, this is what we get to. So what we begin to hear is that there's a fear of loss. There's a fear of getting hurt. There's a fear of separation. Again, back to the theory that I laid out in my prior video on the separation individuation process that has not yet been mastered. This is just one simple example, but two things come to mind immediately. One is there's a fear of venturing into mutual relationships. They would be too painful. So there is indeed a sense of self there, a self to be protected, because it's a self that could be hurt or ashamed or experience pain. But there is something there indeed. And the only reason I'm emphasizing this is because, again, in listening to the social media content, it's often stated that there's nobody home. In fact, there is somebody home. And if you could believe that there's somebody home, that there is a true self hidden away, you are then in a much better position to talk to this person. The second thing that comes to mind, and this is actually another strategy or tool when relating to people like this, when you hear stuff like this, for me at least, I can now begin to appreciate the importance of what we call a maladaptive symptom. What's the maladaptive symptom? I want you to give me all the answers. I want you to do it for me. You take care of me, right? Appreciation of the subjectively useful component of a maladaptive symptom allows you to get much closer to it. It doesn't mean you need to agree with it, right? It just means that you have to get to know it. Remember, this is their best friend. This is part of who they are. You want to make it your best friend as well and get as close to it as possible so that you could be in a position to begin to talk to them about it. These are just a few approaches that I use that I find helpful when working with these individuals. I want to emphasize the importance of asking open-ended questions and to always be curious, like I just illustrated. Being a good, curious listener is a really safe place to start. These are what I would call level 1 interventions and techniques. The ultimate goal is to develop a capacity for language and symbolic functioning. Now, I've heard people say approaching a conversation with a narcissistic individual is impossible because they can't accept feedback. That is partially true. It depends on what is meant by feedback and what kind of feedback. What are you actually giving them? And I hope you realized in all the examples that I have given thus far, the feedback is in the form of being curious, asking questions, helping them begin to think. And by the way, that is feedback, but it's not telling them how to live their life. Let me give one more quick example. Remember this fellow? She could drive me. She's my girlfriend. Why should I not ask her to drop me off and pick me up from work? Why should I take an Uber? This is something we went over in the first part and part 1 of this 2-part series. Employing the techniques that I just mentioned, remain curious. And there's so many directions you could go with somebody who has this kind of demand. Or there's so many directions you can go with somebody who's placing this kind of demand on you. So with this fellow, I would ask, what is it like when she drives you? Tell me about that. What's your experience? In other words, how does that feel? Can you tell me more about that? Or alternatively, what would it be like for you if she didn't drive you? Tell me more about that. This is what I began to hear. I keep telling myself, if she really cares about me, she would do that. My own value and worth are measured by how she does, or how much of what she does that I ask her to do. When someone opens up about their vulnerabilities, try not to downplay their emotions. Appreciate the emotions. Sometimes they sound quite bizarre. Sometimes they may sound crazy. And that would be us just labeling them or being critical. What we really want to do to go back to appreciate the subjectively useful component of a maladaptive symptom. Get closer to it. Appreciate what they're sharing without rushing in. So when they display painful emotions, like, I don't know how to do this, I need you to do it, or I feel worthless, it's really important not to rush in and flood them with solutions, or to tell them that you shouldn't feel that way. That kind of stuff is silly, and it's only going to aggravate them more. If you could put yourself in a position where you remain curious and you begin to hear the things that I just mentioned, this will pave the way for what I would call a level 2 intervention. This is staying very close to remaining curious and not looking to rush in and take care of them and give them solutions to the problem. So in this hypothetical situation, let me play it out a little bit further. I might say, I can see how important it is for you to repair your sense of value and worth. And the way that you figured out how to do this and to get rid of these painful feelings is to get her to drive you. Now I can begin to understand why you put so much pressure on her to drive you and how important that becomes to you. In other words, her driving him back and forth to work, right? This will be the proof, in his mind at least, that he's valuable and worthy. The pursuit of what psychoanalysts term the mode of narcissistic repair takes different forms for each type of narcissism within the clusters. Remember, there are different types or clusters of narcissism. We covered just a few. We focused on the craving, and I've alluded already to the grandiose narcissist in the first video. Understanding the varied approaches of narcissists, be it through overt displays of grandiosity, that's your classical narcissist, manipulations, covertly, which is what we've been discussing, paranoid anxieties. Yes, paranoid anxieties are also a way to repair the damage, or even aggressive tactics is essential for empathizing with and navigating relationships. In my next video, I will take up the mode of repair for the suspicious, also known as the paranoid narcissist. So be sure to stay tuned, and in the meantime, please feel free to reach out with any questions or comments that you have on any of the content that I covered in either part 1 or part 2 of this series on the covert narcissist. Until next time.